You know, my brain did a little stutter step that morning, the kind of glitch you get when you go to step down a stair that isn't there and your stomach just drops into your shoes. I was standing in my living room, holding a mug of coffee that was rapidly losing its heat, staring out the front window expecting to see the gentle, rolling landscape of a fresh suburban snowfall. You know, the kind that looks like a Christmas card before the slush turns it gray. But instead, there was a wall. A solid, perfectly sculpted, unervingly perpendicular wall of snow. It wasn't a drift. Drifts are whimsical, nature's little practical jokes. This was an installation, a blockade, an affront to my civil liberties. It started at one edge of my driveway, rose to about 4 feet, and stretched with an almost architectural precision right across to the other side, completely, utterly, and malevolently sealing me in. Well, that's not right. I murmured to the empty room, my breath fogging up the glass just a little. That is architecturally malicious. I stood there for a beat, letting the sheer unadulterated audacity of it sink in, and immediately, instinctively, I knew who had done this. This had Brenda written all over it. Brenda, our HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of all things beige, boring, and bureaucratic, the woman who once tried to issue me a formal warning because our welcome mat was, and I quote, excessively jovial. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my heaviest coat, and stomped out the front door. The air was biting, sharp enough to freeze the hairs in your nose, but not nearly as biting as the injustice currently residing on my asphalt. Up close, the snow wall was even more impressive. It was packed tight. The sides were smooth like they'd been spackled. It was the Great Wall of Petty. And there, perched right on top, was the cherry on this Sunday of spite. A tiny, lopsided snowman, its button eyes fixed on my front door in a gaze of pure, unblinking judgment. If a snowman could smirk, this one was definitely smirking at me. Subtle, Brenda, I muttered, kicking at the base of the wall. It didn't budge. It was like kicking a frozen sandbag. Of course it didn't move. Brenda's malevolence was always well-constructed, structurally sound. I remembered a conversation with my wife, Sarah, just last week when we were putting out the recycling and Brenda had been standing across the street, just watching us, unmoving, like a lawn ornament that had come to life to haunt us. I told Sarah later that I thought she was measuring the distance between our bins with her eyes, probably checking for regulation spacing, and Sarah, bless her practical heart, just told me to ignore her because she feeds on attention. But standing there staring at Mount Brenda on my driveway, Sarah's advice felt a little inadequate, because how exactly do you ignore Mount Everest when it's taken up residence between you and your ability to go buy milk? The knot of frustration in my gut tightened. This wasn't just snow. This was a statement, a declaration of war fought with frozen water and passive aggression. I made a decision right then. I crunched across my snow-violated lawn toward Brenda's house. Her driveway, naturally, was a masterpiece of snow-clearing efficiency, not a flake out of place. You could have eaten dinner off that asphalt. And there she was, Brenda herself, sitting on her heated porch, wrapped in a fluffy pink robe that probably cost more than my first car, sipping tea from a delicate china cup and surveying her kingdom like a frost queen on her icy throne. "Morning, Brenda," I called out, and my voice was sharper than I intended, cutting through the crisp air. "Interesting new landscaping feature you've installed on my property." She turned her head slowly, a movement that was so calculated it probably took 3 business days to complete, and her perfectly coiffed silver hair didn't even ruffle in the breeze. "Good morning, Michael," she said, her voice smooth and cold as the ice forming on my windshield. "The HOA guidelines are quite clear about snow removal, common areas, and individual responsibilities. Section 4, subsection B, I believe." "Right," I said, jamming my freezing hands into my pockets to keep from making fists. "And did the guidelines, section 4, subsection B, or perhaps the secret unwritten subsection C for general annoyance, mention anything about relocating an entire glacier to block a neighbor's access to civilization?" Brenda took a delicate sip of her tea, her eyes flickering over me with that specific brand of disdain reserved for people who buy store-brand cereal. "Your interpretation of events is vivid, Michael. I simply ensured the community plow, which I personally supervised this morning, had clear access to the common thoroughfare. Any spillover onto your designated private space is, regrettably, your concern. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. She was loving this. This was her art form. Spillover. I nearly choked on the word. Brenda, that is not spillover. That is a siege. That is a carefully constructed 4-foot-high monument to your... Brenda, she interrupted. Perhaps you should have woken up earlier, Michael. Promptness is a virtue. The early bird, as they say, gets the clear driveway. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth hurt. Arguing with Brenda was like trying to explain quantum physics to a brick wall. Pointless, and you just end up looking like the idiot. I was trapped, my car was a hostage, my day was shot. But as I stared at her smug, tea-sipping face, a different kind of fire started to burn in my chest. It wasn't frustration anymore. It was inspiration, a beautifully petty, wonderfully disruptive inspiration that felt a lot like justice. Okay, Brenda, I said, my voice suddenly calm, maybe too calm. You want to play by the rules. I turned and crunched back toward my house, leaving her to her triumphant tea, and I found Sarah at the window, her face a mix of concern and weary resignation. What did Queen Frostine say? She asked as I stomped the snow off my boots. Basically, tough cookies, peasant, I said, shrugging off my coat. She said it was spillover from the community plow she guided. But Sarah, my mind is racing. I'm replaying her words. Common areas, clear access, community plow, and a slow, dangerous grin is spreading across my face because I have an idea so audacious, so beautifully, exquisitely Brenda level in its bureaucratic pettiness that it just might work. Sarah narrowed her eyes at me. Mike, what are you thinking? I know that look. I'm thinking I'm about to do something deeply satisfying and possibly borderline with local ordinances, I said, already reaching for my phone. Not illegal, honey, just creatively compliant. You know how Brenda loves compliance? Well, I win. I just need to make a few calls about a serious public safety concern. A very, very serious one. Sarah sighed, but she was smiling too. Just try not to get us arrested before lunch. No promises, I said, dialing. But I promise it'll be memorable. My living room became my war room. I paced back and forth, the phone warm in my hand. First call, City Public Works Department. I put on my most concerned citizen voice, the one I usually reserve for reporting potholes that could swallow a small dog or streetlights that flickered like a disco. Yes, hello. I began when a man named Gary answered, injecting a tremor of urgency into my tone. I need to report a significant snow obstruction. It's quite alarming. It's completely blocking access to a public fire hydrant on Elm Street. Yes, Elm Street. And the thing is, it seems to be strategically placed, almost like someone doesn't want emergency services to get through, if you catch my drift. I paused for dramatic effect, conveniently omitting the fact that the hydrant was mostly in front of my house and primarily serviced my property line, and that the main emergency was my inability to get to the hardware store for a new shovel because my old one had mysteriously vanished last fall around the same time Brenda complained about its lean angle. Gary sounded like he'd been mainlining caffeine and existential dread since 4 a.m. Sir, we've got a lot of calls this morning. The whole city looks like a Yeti sneeze. A hydrant, you say? Is it an immediate active fire risk right this second? Well, one certainly hopes not, Gary, I said gravely. But with this kind of deliberate, almost engineered blockage, who knows what could happen? It's a real hazard. A mountain of it right in front of number 12. And it's also incidentally affecting my ability to, vacate the premises in an orderly fashion should a fire, heaven forbid, actually occur due to said blocked hydrant. I was laying it on thick, but in for a penny, in for a snow apocalypse. Gary sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 citizen complaints. All right, I'll put it on the list. Might be a while. We're prioritizing main arteries. Oh, I completely understand, Gary. You guys are the heroes of winter, truly, I said, buttering him up like a piece of toast. But I also happened to overhear, just through the grapevine, you know how these things are, that the mayor himself is doing a ride-along today to survey the city's snow removal efforts. It would be a real shame, a public relations black eye, if he saw such a blatant disregard for public safety regulations, especially concerning emergency access right here on Elm Street. Bad photo op, I had, of course, just invented the mayor's ride-along on the spot. But it had the ring of truthiness, didn't it? Mayors love a good snow-related photo op, usually involving them pretending to drive a plow for 10 seconds. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear Gary's caffeine-addled brain cells clicking. The mayor doing a ride-along today? His voice had perked up like a meerkat spotting a particularly juicy grub. Okay, sir. Let me see what I can do. Elm Street, number 12, you said? Blocked hydrant. That's the one, Gary. I confirmed, trying to keep the triumph out of my voice. A clear and present danger to public servitude. Can't miss it. Looks like Brenda's ego exploded. Right. I'm rerouting a crew. Stay warm, sir. He hung up, and I turned to Sarah, a wide grin splitting my face. Phase 1 complete. You're a menace, Michael, she said, shaking her head. I learned from the best. I replied, nodding toward Brenda's house. She's a snow-wielding Machiavelli in a pink robe. We didn't have to wait long. Maybe 30 minutes. Just enough time for another coffee and for the anticipation to build to a delightful, almost unbearable level. I was vibrating. I stationed myself at the living room window, a modern-day general awaiting his troops. Sarah stood beside me, phone camera ready, pretending it was for insurance purposes, but I knew she was as invested in this suburban drama as I was. You really think they'll come? She whispered, like the plows were mythical creatures we'd summoned. Just for that hydrant story? Brenda weaponized snow, Sarah, I said sagely. I'm merely escalating the municipal response to a proportional level. It's practically in the city charter. Probably. Then we heard it. A distant, guttural rumble. Then another, closer. And a third. The unmistakable roar of heavy diesel engines and scraping steel. My grin widened. Showtime. Down the quiet, snow-hushed length of Elm Street they came. Not one, not two, but 3 massive city snowplows. They were glorious, bright yellow behemoths, their warning lights flashing in a synchronized rhythm, moving in a tight V-shaped formation like a mechanized cavalry unit about to charge. It was beautiful. It was overkill. It was perfect. Across the street, Brenda had reappeared on her porch, her tea abandoned. The look of smug satisfaction had vanished, replaced by a delightful, shape of pure, unadulterated confusion. Her head tilted as if trying to understand why a D-Day landing was occurring on her cul-de-sac. The lead plow, which I was now certain was piloted by my new best friend, Gary the gatekeeper, didn't even slow down. It aimed its massive blade directly at the frozen monstrosity barricading my driveway, and hit it with the kind of focused power usually reserved for demolishing small buildings. This was it, the moment I'd be telling my grandkids about. The plows descended upon Mount Brenda with a vengeance. It was less a snow clearing and more an exorcism. Snow, packed and heavy, flew in every direction, up, out, sideways, everywhere except back onto my driveway. It was a ballet of brute force, the massive machines coordinating with an almost delicate precision. They carved, they pushed, they obliterated. I glanced at my phone timer. 2 minutes, I announced to Sarah, who was giggling uncontrollably. And 57 seconds. Impressive. World record time for debrendification. Brenda was a statue of frozen fury on her porch. Her mouth was agape. Her perfect pink robe seemed to have wilted under the sheer shock and awe of the spectacle. But the plows, the glorious, magnificent plows, weren't done. They didn't just stop at my driveway. Because when I'd spoken to Gary, in a moment of truly inspired pettiness, I'd also casually mentioned that the hydrant obstruction seemed to be part of a larger, more troubling pattern of aggressive snow management and territorial encroachment originating from the vicinity of number 14, Brenda's house. I'd implied it was causing hazardous roadway conditions along the entire cul-de-sac. Gary, bless his public servant heart, had apparently taken copious notes. So the convoy proceeded. They meticulously cleared the entire street, every last inch. They scraped the curbs. They smoothed the intersections. And with each pass in front of Brenda's immaculate domain, the drivers, with what I could only describe as artistic flair, angled their plows just so. A little flick of the wrist, a subtle adjustment of the hydraulics, and a delicate, fluffy plume of fresh snow would arc gracefully through the air and land gently, almost poetically, along the very edge of her pristine driveway. Not blocking it, heavens no. That would be unprofessional. Just re-landscaping. enhancing her curb appeal with a tasteful 2-foot-high border of freshly displaced powder. Justice, I murmured to Sarah, my voice thick with satisfaction, is a dish best served cold and plowed. Thoroughly plowed. As the last plow, Gary's chariot, rumbled past for a final majestic sweep, Gary himself leaned out of the cab. He was a big guy, beard frosted with ice, a grin wider than his plow blade. He caught my eye through the window. And then, the legend, he actually winked. Hydrants all clear, sir, he bellowed over the engine noise. And the rest of the hazard too. Looks like we nipped that public safety issue right in the bud. You have a good one. You too, Gary. I shouted back through the glass, giving him a thumbs up that felt woefully inadequate. Gary was my hero. Brenda looked like she'd swallowed a bag of angry wasps. She finally snapped out of her stupor and marched, or rather, skidded precariously in her fluffy pink slippers, across the freshly plowed street toward my now beautifully clear driveway. Her face was a mottled shade of puce. Michael, she shrieked, her voice cracking like thin ice. What is the meaning of this? You called them? This is an outrageous abuse of city resources. This is anarchy. I adopted my most innocent, law-abiding citizen expression. Me, Brenda? I merely reported a significant safety hazard that was endangering public property and potentially lives. As is my civic duty. The Public Works Department seemed to agree it was a serious issue, especially with the mayor doing his rounds. Wouldn't want him to trip over an unauthorized snowdrift, would we? Brenda stared at me, speechless for possibly the first time in her adult life. The mention of the mayor seemed to have short-circuited her outrage. The mayor, she whispered, deflating slightly. Terrible shame if he saw our little Elm Street in such disarray, wouldn't it? I said cheerfully. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a day to get to. Groceries to buy, errands to run. You know, things people with accessible driveways do. I gave her a small, polite wave and turned back toward my house, whistling a Johnny tune. But the sweet taste of victory had a short shelf life in Brenda's world. About 3 days later, just as I was starting to think I'd achieved a lasting peace through overwhelming plow power, an official-looking envelope appeared in our mailbox. Cream-colored, heavy bond paper. Inside, a crisply printed letter. Elm Street Homeowners Association. Official notice. Emergency HOA meeting. Agenda. Unauthorized alteration of common area snow distribution and misuse of municipal services by resident Michael, last name. Further discussion on revised driveway aesthetics. Unauthorized alteration of common area snow distribution? I read aloud to Sarah. Is that even a real thing? It sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. Captain, the aliens are altering the snow distribution. And revised driveway aesthetics? Sarah snorted. Is she planning to mandate driveways and gardens now? She's doubling down. I groaned. This isn't about snow anymore, Sarah. This is about her pride. Her iron-fisted, perfectly manicured HOA guideline quoting pride. I knew I couldn't just ignore this. Brenda armed with a meeting agenda was like a shark armed with a laser beam. So, I decided it was time to see if there were any other fish in Brenda's crosshairs. Operation Suburban Solidarity commenced the next morning. I started with Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down. He was an elderly gentleman, kept to himself mostly, but I'd seen Brenda lecturing him about his rose bushes once. Mr. Henderson, I said, standing on his porch. Brenda's called an emergency meeting about me and snow. Mr. Henderson's kindly eyes twinkled. Ah, Brenda, our little neighborhood Napoleon. What's she accusing you of this time? Aggressive snowman placement. Close, I said. Apparently, I altered the common area snow distribution. He chuckled, a dry, papery sound. Sounds like her. She tried to find me last summer because my garden gnome, Bartholomew, was, and I quote, excessively whimsical and projecting a nonconformist ethos potentially disruptive to community visual harmony. Bartholomew the gnome? I asked. What did you do? Told her Bartholomew was a combat veteran with a Purple Heart and to show some respect. She hasn't mentioned him since. I liked Mr. Henderson. Next, I visited the Rodriguez family across the street. Maria was a young mom with 2 energetic kids. Maria, got a sec? It's about Brenda. Her eyes widened. Oh no, did she see the kids' hopscotch outline? She told me last week it was an unapproved public art installation, and I had until Friday to rectify the graffiti. Worse, I said, explaining the snowplow saga. Maria listened, her expression shifting from concern to outright glee. Oh, Michael, that's brilliant. Count me in for that meeting. I've got a few things to say about unstructured aerial activities myself. It turned out Elm Street was a powder keg of suppressed Brenda-related grievances. By the time the emergency HOA meeting rolled around on Thursday evening, our little band of suburban rebels was ready. The community center's stuffy meeting room was more packed than I'd ever seen it. Usually, these things were attended by Brenda, two bewildered board members, and Mrs. Periwinkle, who came for the free cookies. Tonight, it was standing room only. Brenda was at the front, naturally, looking imperious behind a folding table. She had a gavel. A literal gavel. She banged it. This emergency meeting is now in session, she declared. She launched into her presentation, which included blurry photos of the Snowplows, Exhibit A, and a dramatic recounting of how her curated streetscape had been violated. She painted me as a suburban anarchist. When she finally finished, a smug smile on her face, I stood up. Brenda, I began calmly. That was a very creative interpretation. The common area snow distribution was a 4-foot wall blocking my home. I reported a safety hazard, a blocked fire hydrant. The city responded. Then, before she could unleash another volley, Mr. Henderson rose slowly. Brenda, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Speaking of alterations and aesthetics, I'd like to discuss Bartholomew, my gnome. Brenda's eye twitched. Mr. Henderson, this is hardly the time. Oh, I think it is. If a gnome can be considered a threat to visual harmony, then perhaps the real threat here is an overzealous interpretation of bylaws by someone with too much time on her hands. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Maria stood up. And what about chalk art, Brenda? My kids can't draw a sun on the sidewalk. It was a floodgate opening. One by one, residents shared their tales of petty tyranny. The meeting dissolved into comedic chaos. Brenda, for once, was on the back foot, her face flushing, her gavel useless against the tide of public opinion. It was beautiful, but the final nail in the coffin came the next morning. I was nursing a headache from the meeting when I heard a knock at the door. It was a sturdy guy in a work coat, holding a clipboard. A landscaping truck was parked at the curb. Mike, he asked, got a work order here from a Ms. Brenda. Says you requested an emergency, a driveway snow mitigation assessment, and decorative berm construction consultation. He looked confused. She paid upfront cash. Said it was urgent. I stared at him. His name tag read Sal's Supreme Landscaping. A slow, incredulous laugh bubbled up. Brenda, in her fury to nail me, must have called a contractor to get evidence of my alterations, but her jargon was so thick she had accidentally hired him to help me build better snow berms. She was trying to play 4D chess and checkmated herself. Well, Sal, I grinned. Since she's paying, let's consult. I'm thinking something tasteful for next winter, perhaps with gargoyles made of ice and a moat. Sal broke into a wide grin. I like the way you think. Decorative berms, you say? We stood in my driveway and loudly discussed the structural integrity of imaginary snow fortifications. Now for the ice gargoyles, I mused, loud enough for Brenda to hear through her lace curtains. Do you think Gothic or abstract modern? Brenda couldn't take it. Her front door burst open and she flew down the steps, pink robe flapping. What is the meaning of this? I hired you to document his infractions, not collaborate on this frozen folly. Sal just held up the paperwork. Ma'am, it says consultation. You paid for an hour. We're exploring options. And we're making fantastic progress, Brenda. I chimed in. Sal has wonderful ideas for the precipitation redirection system. Brenda sputtered. She made a noise like a teapot exploding, stomped her foot, and marched back into her house, slamming the door so hard her wind chimes tangled. It was the white flag. The aftermath was surprisingly peaceful. The HOA board, terrified of another insurrection, quietly clarified the bylaws. The excessive whimsy rule was retired. Brenda was still around, but she was subdued. The imperious set of her jaw had softened. I became a minor local legend, the Snow King of Elm Street. I even got a Christmas card from Gary the plow driver that just said, "Stay frosty." Months later, spring arrived. I was out front coaxing some life into my grass when Sal drove by. He rolled down his window. Hey, Mike. Need any squirrel deterrent system consultations? I laughed. Not today, Sal. Thanks. I stood there, coffee in hand, looking at my peaceful street. The sun was shining. No 4-foot walls of spite in sight. Just a normal, quiet neighborhood where gnomes were free to be whimsical and chalk art was legal. Sometimes a little bit of snow, or a whole lot of it strategically relocated, can change everything. And for the first time in a long time, the only thing I worried about was whether my grass would ever turn green. It was a good feeling. A very good feeling indeed. So, have you ever had a neighbor who tried to bury you in regulations or snow? What did you do? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this little tale of suburban warfare, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold. Thanks for watching.